Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. There are things that move in the spaces between what we know and what we refuse to acknowledge. In the vast emptiness of northern Canada, where civilization thins to nothing more than scattered homesteads and forgotten roads, these things find purchase in the darkness. They wait. They watch. They hunger. I learned this truth when I was 14, during a winter that seemed to stretch on forever. What I witnessed in those frozen months changed me in ways I'm still discovering. Some nights, even now, I wake to the sound of something breathing against glass, though I live in a city apartment 3 stories up. Some nights, I catch myself checking locks twice, 3 times, knowing that what hunts in the dark has learned patience. This is my account of those months. This is my warning. The creatures I encountered defy easy classification. They are not the stuff of legend or folklore, though I suspect our ancestors knew of them and created stories to keep their children close to the fire. They are real, corporeal, and far more intelligent than any wild animal has a right to be. They study us with the same cold fascination we might reserve for insects under glass, and once they notice you, they never forget. I used to live out in the country, up north in Canada, far out in the sticks. You had to bike or drive to go anywhere, aside from a small little taco stand that served food so greasy it could fuel a snowmobile. At night, it would get pretty dark too. The kind of dark that city folks never understand, where the absence of light becomes a physical presence pressing against your windows. With my mother and stepdad, we had a few small dogs and a cat. I was often left in charge of all of them while my parents worked late shifts or disappeared into their bedroom with bottles of wine and hushed arguments. I was kind of resentful for all the extra work, on top of my schooling and homework. But I loved the animals, so I couldn't blame them too much, unless they made a huge mess. Then I'd be pretty ticked. But that's not the entirety of why this is relevant. What is that I would routinely take them out, all before going to bed. I would go to bed very, very late at night, like any 14-year-old with such lax parenting. My dogs would usually stay in the front yard, which was a very vast acreage of flat land, with a tiny ditch running along the property line. It was easy to see the small dogs and call them back in when the cold became too much for their small frames. The winter had been particularly brutal that year. Snow fell in sheets for days at a time, and the wind howled across our property with a voice that sounded almost human. The temperature regularly dropped to -30, cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. On nights like those, even our hardiest dog, Rex, would do his business quickly and bolt for the door. But that night was different. The wind had died to an unsettling stillness, and the snow had stopped falling. The silence was profound. No traffic, no distant machinery, not even the usual creaking of trees. Just the soft huff of breathing and the crunch of paws on snow. Sometimes one of the dogs would wander farther than I liked. My mother's terrier, Duchess, had a bit of a rebellious side to her, but it wasn't her who took off this night. It was the cocker spaniel, Penny. She was usually protective and watchful, keeping the others in line while they played. Seeing her bolt toward the back of the house sent a spike of worry through me. Frustrated and shivering in my thin jacket, I ran after her around to the back of the house, which sloped steeply toward a waterway that was an offshoot of the Red River. The slope was treacherous in winter, covered in a sheet of ice that could send you sliding all the way down to the frozen creek below. What I saw slowly sprawling across the slope coming in our direction still gives me the chills, even now, years later. These things were about chest height to me and maybe 20 feet away, moving with a deliberate, predatory gait that set every nerve in my body on edge. Very grotesque looking, like they were covered in rotting dead flesh, skin that hung in strips from their frames, revealing patches of what looked like yellowed bone underneath. But they moved on all fours with an unnatural fluidity, their long legs creating an unsettling rhythm as they picked their way up the slope. The legs were wrong somehow. Too long, especially in the back, giving them a hunched hyena-like posture that spoke of barely contained aggression. But it was their faces that truly terrified me. They turned their almost rotting faces to look over at us at the top of the slope, and I felt my knees go weak. Their eyes were large and glowed in the faint light from our back porch, not reflecting the light like a normal animal's eyes might, but generating their own cold illumination, like big white marbles filled with phosphorescent fog. The glow pulsed slightly, as if synchronized with some alien heartbeat. When they looked at us, I understood with crystal clarity that we were being evaluated, measured. These weren't mindless beasts driven by hunger or territory. There was intelligence behind those eyes, cold and calculating, and utterly without empathy. Luckily, Penny had frozen at the top of the slope with me, her hackles raised like a hyena's, making her appear twice her normal size. A low growl rumbled in her chest, but I could hear the terror underneath it. She knew, just as I did, that we were looking at something that shouldn't exist. The creatures were still walking and pacing around in the snow, making sure to keep an eye on us like we were a newly discovered threat, or perhaps a newly discovered opportunity. They moved with the patience of predators who had learned that the best hunts required careful observation. I counted 4 of them, though there might have been more hiding in the shadows cast by the trees along the creek. They communicated with each other through subtle movements, a tilt of the head, a shift in posture that suggested a level of coordination that made my skin crawl. The largest of them, positioned at the front of the group, never took its eyes off me. Even when the others would look away to scan the area or investigate something in the snow, this one maintained its steady, unblinking stare. I had the unshakable feeling that it was memorizing me. My scent, my appearance, the sound of my breathing in the cold air. Fear hit me like a physical blow. Not the sudden startle of a jump scare, but the deep, primal terror that comes from recognizing that you are prey. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move slowly, deliberately. I grabbed Penny by crouching quickly, my hands shaking as I scooped her warm body against my chest. The moment I moved, all 4 creatures tensed, their glowing eyes brightening. But they didn't advance. They simply watched, as if filing away this new information for future use. Fighting the urge to bolt in panic, I backed away carefully, then turned and ran around to the side of the house toward the front door. My boots slipped on the ice, and I nearly fell twice, but the terror gave me a coordination I didn't know I possessed. "Come on, come on," I whispered frantically, calling for the other 2 dogs. Rex and Duchess were already sitting at the door, pressed against the frame as if they could will it to open. They must have sensed something was wrong long before I did. Dogs have instincts about these things that we've mostly forgotten. I fumbled with the door handle, my fingers numb from cold and adrenaline, finally managing to get us all inside. The warmth of the house hit me like a wave, but it did nothing to ease the chill that had settled into my bones. I refused to take them out after dark after that, which unfortunately resulted in plenty of messes I had to clean up. But better to clean urine from the kitchen floor than to face those things again. At least that's what I told myself. I would occasionally see these strange things, these weird creatures, wandering outside of our house after that. It gave me the creeps. They'd only look up at my house if I had the lights on and was obviously moving around where they could see me. They were learning our patterns, I realized, studying us. During the day, I found strange tracks in the snow around our property. They were unlike anything I'd seen before. Too large for dogs, too narrow for bears, with what looked like claw marks extending well beyond where normal paths would end. The tracks circled our house in wide arcs, coming closer with each circuit. as if whatever made them was slowly building up the courage for a more direct approach. But it was the way the tracks stopped abruptly at certain points that truly unnerved me. Not faded or obscured by wind, but simply ended, as if whatever made them had suddenly decided to approach from a different angle, or had learned to move without leaving traces. The worst part was the waiting. Every night, as I lay in my basement bedroom, I found myself listening for sounds that didn't belong. The soft pad of feet on snow, the scrape of claws against siding, the gentle testing of windows and doors. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I heard them. Sleep became elusive after that first encounter. Every creak of the house settling, every whisper of wind against the windows, sent my heart racing. I developed the habit of checking locks multiple times before bed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that simple metal and wood wouldn't be much of a barrier if those things decided they wanted inside. The basement bedroom I'd claimed as my own had seemed like a good idea when we'd first moved in. It was larger than the upstairs rooms, cooler in summer, and gave me the privacy a 14-year-old craved. Now, surrounded by foundation walls and with only one small window that looked out onto the backyard, it felt like a trap. That window overlooked the area where I'd first seen them. During the day, I could see the slope leading down to the frozen creek, the tracks in the snow creating intricate patterns that spoke of regular visits. But at night, the window became a source of constant anxiety. I'd hung thick curtains across it, but found myself compulsively checking to make sure they were completely closed. 3 weeks after the first sighting, I woke up in the middle of the night to the radio's digital display flashing 3:17 a.m. The house was dead quiet, no furnace cycling, no refrigerator humming, just the profound silence that only comes in the deepest part of winter. I wasn't sure why I'd woken up. No unusual sounds, no dreams I could remember. Just the sudden, jarring transition from sleep to full alertness that sometimes happens when your subconscious detects something your conscious mind hasn't processed yet. I lay still for several minutes, listening, waiting for whatever had disturbed me to reveal itself. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. There was something outside my window. I could sense its presence before I could see or hear it, the way you might feel someone watching you in a crowded room, or notice a shadow that doesn't belong. The air in my room felt different, charged with a tension that made my skin crawl. Moving as slowly as possible, I turned my head toward the window. The curtains were still closed, but there was a wrongness to the light filtering through them. Instead of the pale blue glow of snow under starlight, there was a warmer, more focused illumination, as if something was casting its own light against the glass. Then I heard it. A soft snuffling sound, like a large dog investigating an interesting scent. But this wasn't the casual exploration of a curious animal. There was an intelligence to it, a methodical quality that suggested deliberate investigation. The basement window was set into the foundation, positioned so that someone outside would have to crouch down to look through it. The thought of one of those creatures lowering itself to peer into my room made my stomach clench with revulsion. I forced myself to remain perfectly still, though every muscle in my body was tensed for flight. Moving might attract its attention, let it know that I was awake and aware of its presence. Better to let it think I was sleeping. The snuffling continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, gradually, I became aware of a new element, the sound of breathing that didn't belong to me. Slow, measured inhalations and exhalations, occasionally punctuated by what sounded almost like whispered words in a language I didn't recognize. The breathing seemed to be coming from directly in front of the window, close enough to fog the glass. I could picture it out there, crouched in the snow, its grotesque face pressed against the cold surface as it tried to peer through the curtains. Then came the tapping. Soft at first, almost gentle, like someone politely requesting entry. Tap, tap, tap against the glass, followed by a pause, then 3 more taps. The pattern repeated several times, and I began to understand with growing horror that it was trying to get my attention. It wanted me to look. The tapping grew more insistent, the pauses shorter. Whatever was out there was losing patience with my lack of response. Part of me, the curious, rational part, wanted to peek through the curtains, to finally get a clear look at what had been haunting our property. But a deeper, more primitive part of my brain screamed warnings about what might happen if I made eye contact with the thing outside. Then, abruptly, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds had been. I strained to hear any indication of movement, footsteps in the snow, the rustle of fabric, anything that might tell me where it had gone. But there was nothing. Minutes passed. My muscles began to cramp from holding the same position, but I didn't dare move. For all I knew, it was still there, watching, waiting for me to betray my awareness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard a new sound. A low, guttural vocalization that might have been communication or might have been frustration. It was answered by a similar sound from somewhere farther away, then another from a different direction entirely. They were coordinating, talking to each other. The realization hit me like ice water. These weren't solitary creatures that had randomly discovered our property. They were a group, possibly even a family or pack, and they were actively working together to study us. More concerning was the implication that they had developed enough interest in our household to station watchers. The one at my window hadn't been there by accident. It had been assigned to observe, to learn our patterns and vulnerabilities. I lay frozen in my bed until dawn, listening to the occasional sound of movement around the house. They circled the property several times, their footsteps creating a complex pattern in the snow that I would discover later. But they never tried to enter, never tested doors or other windows. They were being patient, learning. When the first gray light of dawn finally crept through the curtains, I heard them withdraw. Not fleeing, but conducting what sounded like an orderly retreat, their footsteps growing fainter as they moved back toward the creek and whatever shelter they'd found in the woods beyond. I finally allowed myself to move, my joints stiff and aching from hours of immobility. The relief of daylight was overwhelming, but it came with the knowledge that they would be back, and next time they might be bolder. I never told my parents about that night. How could I explain that we were being watched by things that shouldn't exist, that they were studying us with the patience of scientists and the hunger of predators? Instead, I began my own investigation. If these creatures were real, and the evidence of my senses insisted they were, then they had to have some basis in the natural world. They had to fit into some category of known phenomena, even if they challenged our understanding of what was possible. But as I would soon discover, some things exist in the spaces between categories, in the gaps where our knowledge fails and our assumptions crumble. Some things are content to remain mysteries, patient and watchful in the dark. The school library in our tiny town was a joke. 3 dusty rooms with books that seemed to predate the internet by decades. But it was the only resource I had, and I was desperate for answers. Every day after classes, I would bike the 5 miles to town and spend hours hunched over outdated encyclopedias and regional history texts, searching for any mention of creatures that matched what I'd seen. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, was a thin woman with worried eyes who seemed perpetually startled by the presence of actual patrons. She watched me with growing concern as my research became more frantic, more focused on local legends and wildlife behavior. "Researching for a school project?" she asked one afternoon, hovering near my table as I flipped through a book about northern Canadian fauna. "Something like that," I muttered, not looking up from a grainy photograph of a timber wolf. The proportions were wrong, but it was the closest thing I'd found to what I'd witnessed. "You know, if you're interested in local stories, you might want to talk to some of the older folks in town. They remember things that never made it into books." That gave me an idea. Over the next few days, I started hanging around the general store and the gas station, places where people gathered to gossip and share stories. I learned to listen for fragments of conversation that might be relevant, to ask casual questions that wouldn't mark me as someone obsessed with the impossible. Old Henrik Volkov, who ran the bait shop, was the most promising source. He'd lived in the area for 70 years, back when there were still trappers and prospectors working the deep woods. When I mentioned seeing strange tracks around our property, his weathered face went very still. "You best stay close to the house after dark," he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "Some things are better left alone." "What kind of things?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, almost whispering, he said, "My grandfather called them the Hollow Ones. Said they came up from the deep places during the hardest winters when the ice got thick enough to support their weight." "What did they look like?" Henrik's hands trembled slightly as he arranged fishing lures on the counter. "Like death walking around in skin that didn't fit quite right. He said they were always hungry, but not for food. Hungry for something else. Warmth, maybe. Life." "Did anyone ever see them clearly?" "Some did. Those folks mostly ended up dead or disappeared." He finally looked at me directly, his pale blue eyes full of ancient worry. "Whatever you think you saw out there, son, you need to forget about it, and you need to keep your family safe." The conversation left me more unsettled than before. If Henrik's grandfather had known about these creatures, that meant they'd been in the area for generations. It also meant that other people had encountered them and suffered for it. I started paying more attention to local newspaper archives, looking for patterns in missing persons reports or unexplained deaths. What I found was disturbing. A steady trickle of disappearances over the decades, mostly during the coldest months, mostly people who lived in isolated areas like ours. The reports were frustratingly vague. Search parties would find strange tracks that led nowhere. Personal belongings discovered in impossible locations. Witnesses who spoke of seeing figures moving through the trees that couldn't have been human, but weren't quite animal either. Most disturbing were the accounts from survivors, people who'd encountered something in the woods and lived to tell about it. Their stories shared common elements: glowing eyes, rotting flesh, an intelligence that felt malevolent and alien. Many of them had been dismissed as traumatized or delusional, but the consistency of their descriptions was hard to ignore. At home, the situation was deteriorating. My parents had noticed my changed behavior, the constant checking of locks, the refusal to take the dogs out after dark, the way I flinched at unexpected sounds. They attributed it to typical teenage moodiness, but I could see growing concern in their faces. The dogs were affected too. They'd become nervous and clingy, reluctant to go outside even during the day. Penny, who had always been brave to the point of recklessness, now cowered behind the couch whenever the wind rattled the windows. Rex had started having what looked like nightmares, whimpering and pawing at the air in his sleep. The tracks around our house were becoming more numerous and more complex. They formed intricate patterns that suggested planning and coordination. Some mornings I would find them arranged in perfect circles around the house, as if the creatures had performed some kind of ritual in the snow. More disturbing were the signs that they were testing our defenses. Scratches appeared on the siding near windows and doors, too high to be made by any normal animal. Garbage cans were overturned with surgical precision, their contents examined but not consumed. Tools left in the yard were moved to different locations, arranged in ways that suggested intelligence and purpose. I began sleeping with a flashlight under my pillow and a knife from the kitchen hidden in my dresser drawer. Not that I thought either would be particularly effective against creatures that could outrun and overpower me without effort, but they provided a psychological comfort that helped me get through the nights. The worst part was the waiting. I could feel them out there, watching, planning, growing bolder with each passing day. Their visits were becoming more frequent and more invasive. Sometimes I would wake to find new scratches on my bedroom window, as if something had been trying to work its claws under the frame. I started having dreams where I could see through their eyes, looking back at our house from the edge of the woods. In these dreams, Our home appeared impossibly bright and warm, a beacon of life in the cold wilderness. And I understood with dream logic clarity that this warmth was exactly what they wanted. They were hungry for it. Not just the heat, but the essence of life itself. The electrical activity of our brains, the chemical energy of our blood, the spark of consciousness that separated us from mere meat. And they were patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to take it. By late February, the situation had become untenable. The creatures' visits were now a nightly occurrence, and their behavior was growing increasingly bold. They no longer retreated at the first sign of dawn, sometimes lingering until full daylight before disappearing into the woods. My parents had started to notice the damage around the property: scratches on doors and windows, overturned items in the yard, strange impressions in the snow that couldn't be explained away as deer tracks or wind patterns. My stepfather had even mentioned installing security cameras, though I doubted conventional surveillance would capture anything useful. The dogs were becoming unbearable to live with. They barked constantly at windows and doors, their fur standing on end at sounds only they could hear. Duchess had developed a nervous habit of circling the same spot on the kitchen floor for hours at a time. Rex refused to eat unless someone stayed with him, and Penny had begun hiding under furniture whenever the sun started to set. Something was building toward a climax. I could feel it in the quality of the silence outside, in the way the creatures moved with increasing confidence around our property. They were preparing for something, and I had the sick certainty that whatever they were planning would happen soon. The confrontation came on a night when my parents had driven to town for dinner and a movie, leaving me alone with the animals. I'd tried to talk them out of going, making excuses about feeling sick or needing help with homework, but they insisted I was old enough to handle a few hours by myself. As their car disappeared down the driveway, I felt a wave of vulnerability wash over me. The house suddenly seemed enormous and full of hidden spaces where threats could lurk. Every shadow held potential danger. Every sound carried sinister implications. I'd prepared as well as I could. All the doors and windows were locked, with chairs propped against the handles for extra security. I'd gathered the animals in the living room where I could keep an eye on all of them, and positioned myself with clear sight lines to multiple exits. But as darkness fell, I realized how inadequate my preparations really were. The first sign came from the dogs. All three of them suddenly went rigid, their heads turning in unison toward the back of the house. Their ears were flattened against their skulls, and low growls rumbled in their chests like distant thunder. Then I heard it, a sound I'd been dreading for weeks. The soft scrape of claws against wood, coming from somewhere near the back door. Not the random scratching of an animal marking territory, but the deliberate probing of something testing for weakness. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a more disturbing sound. What sounded like whispered conversation in a language I couldn't understand. Multiple voices, coordinating their efforts. Planning. I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the back of the house, staying low and moving as quietly as possible. The dogs followed me, their fear overridden by loyalty and pack instinct. Through the kitchen window, I caught glimpses of movement in the yard, pale shapes flowing between the trees like predatory ghosts. The back door suddenly shuddered in its frame, as if something heavy had thrown itself against it. The deadbolt held, but I could see the wood around the lock starting to splinter. They weren't just testing anymore. They were trying to get in. I ran back to the living room and grabbed the cordless phone, my hands shaking as I dialed my parents' cell number. The call went straight to voicemail. They must have been in the movie theater where phones were supposed to be turned off. Another impact against the back door, harder this time. The sound of splintering wood was clearly audible, and I knew it wouldn't hold much longer. I needed a plan, but my mind was frozen with terror and indecision. That's when I heard the sound that nearly stopped my heart, the slow, deliberate turning of the front door handle. While I'd been focused on the back door, they'd circled around to try the main entrance. The door was locked, but as I watched in horror, The handle continued to turn with mechanical precision. They were learning how our mechanisms worked, testing the limits of our technology. The handle snapped back to its normal position, followed by what sounded like frustrated muttering. But the reprieve was temporary. Within seconds, I heard the soft scraping of claws against the door frame, probing for gaps or weaknesses. I was trapped. They had the house surrounded, and it was only a matter of time before they found a way in. The windows were too small for me to escape through. And even if I could, they would see me the moment I tried to run. That's when inspiration struck. If they were drawn to warmth and life, maybe I could use that against them. Create a distraction that would give me enough time to reach help. I ran to the basement and grabbed several space heaters from storage, plugging them in around the living room and turning them to maximum heat. Then I opened the refrigerator and began pulling out every piece of meat I could find. Steaks, chicken, anything that might carry the scent of blood and life. The plan was desperate and probably suicidal, but it was all I had. I would use the heated meat to create a powerful lure, hopefully drawing them to one side of the house while I escaped from the other. I arranged the meat near the back door, where the scratching sounds were loudest, then set up the space heaters to create a warm pocket of air that would carry the scent. The dogs watched me with confusion and growing anxiety, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The effect was immediate. The sounds of movement outside became more agitated, more focused. I could hear them gathering near the back of the house, drawn by the concentrated scent of warmth and blood. This was my chance. I gathered the dogs and crept toward the front door, moving as quietly as possible. My plan was to reach the car in the driveway and drive to town for help, assuming the keys were where my stepfather usually left them. I slowly unlocked the front door, wincing at every small sound the mechanism made. The dogs pressed close to my legs, trembling but ready to follow my lead. Through the window, I could see that the front yard was clear. All the creatures seemed to have moved to investigate the distraction at the back of the house. I opened the door and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to move quickly across the snow toward the car. We were halfway there when I realized my mistake. The keys weren't in the ignition where I'd hoped. My stepfather must have taken them inside, and now we were exposed in the open yard with no shelter and no easy escape route. That's when I heard the sound that shattered my hopes, a long, piercing howl from behind the house, answered by similar calls from multiple directions. They'd discovered my ruse and were communicating our location to the others. Within seconds, shapes began emerging from the tree line around the property. They moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit, cutting off potential escape routes and herding us toward the center of the yard. I found myself face to face with the largest of the creatures, the one I'd first seen on the slope weeks ago. Up close, the details of its appearance were even more horrifying than I'd remembered. Its flesh hung in rotting strips that revealed patches of yellowed bone underneath. Its eyes glowed with that same cold phosphorescence, but now I could see intelligence behind them. Ancient, patient, and utterly alien. It studied me for a long moment, tilting its head like a curious predator examining prey. When it opened its mouth, I expected to see fangs or some other obvious weapon. Instead, I saw rows of perfectly human teeth, white and straight and completely wrong in that decaying face. "We have been watching," it said in a voice like wind through dried leaves. "Learning. You interest us." The fact that it could speak, that it was capable of human language, somehow made the situation infinitely worse. This wasn't a simple predator acting on instinct. This was something that could think, plan, and communicate its intentions. "What do you want?" I managed to whisper. It smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than any snarl would have been. "To understand. You burn so brightly in the dark. We wonder what it would be like to carry that warmth inside us." The other creatures had formed a loose circle around us, their glowing eyes creating a constellation of malevolent stars in the darkness. The dogs huddled against my legs, whimpering but not fleeing. They knew, as I did, that running would only trigger a chase reflex. "Your family will return soon," the creature continued. "We will wait. We have learned patience in our long years beneath the ice." That revelation hit me like a sledgehammer. They weren't just opportunistic predators. They were ancient things that had been waiting in the frozen depths for the right moment to emerge. And somehow, our family had attracted their attention. "Please," I said, though I wasn't sure what I was asking for. Mercy from something that clearly didn't understand the concept. Time to prepare for the inevitable. The creature's smile widened, and I noticed that its teeth weren't quite as human as I'd first thought. They were too sharp, too numerous, designed for tearing rather than chewing. "You may choose," it said. "Come with us now, willingly, and your family will be left unharmed. Or wait for their return, and we will take all of you together." The choice was no choice at all, but it gave me something to focus on other than pure terror. I needed to buy time, to think of some way out of this nightmare. "If I come with you," I said, "how do I know you'll keep your word?" "You don't," it replied with what might have been amusement. "But we are not entirely without honor. We take only what we need when we need it. Your sacrifice would sustain us for many seasons." As it spoke, I became aware of a new sound in the distance. The low rumble of an approaching car engine. My parents were coming home early, driving straight into a situation they couldn't possibly understand or survive. The creature heard it too, its head swiveling toward the road with predatory alertness. The others in the circle shifted restlessly, their excitement growing as they sensed approaching prey. "It seems your family has made the choice for you," it said. The headlights swept across the yard as my parents' car pulled into the driveway, illuminating the nightmare scene that awaited them. I saw my mother's face through the windshield, her expression changing from casual homecoming to shock to terror in the space of a heartbeat. The car skidded to a stop, and I could hear my stepfather shouting something to my mother, probably telling her to lock the doors and call for help. But the creatures were already moving, flowing across the snow with inhuman speed to surround the vehicle. "No!" I screamed, breaking free from my paralysis. "Leave them alone! I'll go with you!" The largest creature, their leader, I realized, raised a hand to halt the others. They stopped moving but maintained their positions around the car, ready to act at the first sign of resistance. "Your offer is noted," it said, "but circumstances have changed. We had not planned to harvest so much life force at once, but opportunity rarely announces itself." Through the car windows, I could see my parents' terrified faces. My mother was frantically trying to use her cell phone, but we were too far from any cell tower for the signal to reach. My stepfather had pulled something from the glove compartment, probably the small pistol he kept for emergencies. But even from this distance, I could see his hands shaking. The weapon would be useless against these things. I doubted conventional bullets would even slow them down, and the sound would only serve to alert them that he was armed and dangerous. "Please," I said again, stepping closer to the lead creature. "Take me and let them go. I'm young, healthy. I'll last longer than 2 adults." For a moment, something that might have been consideration flickered across its rotting features. Then it shook its head with what looked like genuine regret. "You misunderstand our nature," it said. "We do not simply consume flesh or blood. We feed on the spark of consciousness itself, the electrical patterns that make you more than mere meat. Fear enhances this process, makes the energy more potent. Your family's terror will make their essence particularly nourishing." The casual way it described the process of consuming our life force made my stomach lurch. These things didn't just kill their prey. They literally ate their souls, their consciousness, everything that made them human. But there was something in its explanation that gave me an idea. If they fed on consciousness and fear enhanced the process, then maybe the opposite was also true. Maybe peace or acceptance would make the energy less appetizing. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation was all I had left. I forced myself to relax, to let go of the terror that had been driving me for weeks. Instead of fighting the situation, I tried to accept it. If this was how my story ended, then at least I could try to save my family in the process. The change in my emotional state was immediate and noticeable. The lead creature's glowing eyes flickered with what looked like confusion, and several of the others tilted their heads as if trying to understand what had changed. "Interesting," it murmured. "Your energy signature has altered. You are no longer afraid." "I'm tired of being afraid," I said, and realized it was true. The constant vigilance, the sleepless nights, the crushing weight of keeping this secret. I was exhausted by all of it. "If you're going to kill us, just do it. But stop playing with us first." The creature stepped closer, studying me with renewed interest. When it spoke again, its voice carried a note of respect that hadn't been there before. "You are stronger than we anticipated. Most humans break long before reaching this point. Most humans probably don't have weeks to get used to the idea." It made a sound that might have been laughter, dry and rustling like autumn leaves in the wind. "True. We have been less subtle than usual, but your family's energy signatures were particularly intriguing. We wanted to study you before the harvest." Behind us, I could hear my stepfather shouting through the car window, demanding to know what was happening. The sound of his voice broke my heart, but I forced myself to maintain the emotional calm that seemed to be confusing our captors. "What would it take for you to let them go?" I asked. "Nothing you could provide," it replied. "We have waited too long, spent too much energy emerging from the deep places. The hunger is too great now to be satisfied with partial measures." That's when I noticed something that gave me hope. The other creatures were becoming restless, shifting from foot to foot in a way that suggested discomfort. My emotional state was affecting them somehow, making the prospect of feeding less appealing. "You feed on fear," I said, pieces of the puzzle clicking together in my mind. "But what happens when there is no fear? What happens when your prey accepts death willingly?" The lead creature's expression grew wary. "You speak of things beyond your understanding." "Do I? You said fear enhances the feeding process. That implies there's something about terror that makes consciousness more digestible. So what happens when that enhancement isn't there?" I took another step closer, and this time the creature actually backed away slightly. The others in the circle were making low, agitated sounds, like predators who had suddenly realized their prey might be poisonous. "You become just another predator fighting for survival," I continued, understanding flooding through me. "Without the fear, without the enhanced energy, feeding on us becomes a desperate act instead of a feast. And desperate acts have consequences." The creature's eyes flared brighter, and I could see anger replacing the cold calculation that had been there before. "You think you understand, but you see only fragments of a larger truth. Then explain it to me. What are you really?" For a long moment I thought it wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice heavy with ancient weariness, it said, "We are what remains when life grows too cold, when the spark of consciousness begins to fade. We were like you once, long ago, before the ice came and drove us deep into the earth. We learned to feed on the warmth of others to maintain our own existence, but the process changed us, made us into something neither alive nor dead." The revelation reframed everything. These weren't alien predators or supernatural monsters. They were people, or had been people, who had found a way to survive in conditions that should have killed them. The cost of that survival had been their humanity, but they retained enough of their original nature to understand what they had lost. "How long?" I asked. "Centuries. Maybe longer. Time moves differently in the deep places, where the Earth's heat keeps the ice at bay. I could hear my parents getting out of their car, my stepfather shouting at them to stay back while my mother called my name in a voice thick with terror. They were going to try to rescue me, which would only get them killed. There has to be another way, I said desperately. Some alternative to feeding on conscious beings. Perhaps, it admitted. But alternatives require exploration, experimentation. We have grown comfortable with what we know works. Comfortable killing people. Comfortable surviving. It corrected. You would do the same in our position. Maybe it was right. Maybe anyone faced with the choice between death and becoming a monster would choose monstrosity. But that didn't make it acceptable, and it didn't mean there weren't other options. What if we helped you find alternatives? I said. My family, other people in the area. What if we worked together to find a way for you to survive without killing? The creature laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Your kind fears us too much for cooperation. You would study us, perhaps, but only to find better ways to destroy us. Some would, but not everyone. Not if they understood what you really are. I could see doubt creeping into its expression, the possibility of hope warring with centuries of bitter experience. The other creatures had grown quieter, as if they too were considering possibilities they'd never allowed themselves to imagine. But the moment of potential understanding was shattered by the sharp crack of a gunshot. My stepfather had finally worked up the courage to fire, though his shot went wide and struck one of the smaller creatures in the shoulder. The wounded thing screamed, a sound like tearing metal, and staggered backward, black fluid streaming from the wound. The lead creature's expression hardened instantly, all traces of doubt or consideration vanishing. "Negotiations are ended," it snarled. They moved as one, flowing toward my parents with deadly intent. I ran after them, shouting for my family to get back in the car, to drive away and leave me behind. But they were too frightened to think clearly, too focused on trying to reach me to understand the danger. What followed was a nightmare of violence and chaos. The creatures moved too fast for human reflexes, their rotting forms proving surprisingly resilient to physical damage. My stepfather managed to fire 3 more shots before they overwhelmed him, and while the bullets clearly caused pain, they didn't slow the attack significantly. I reached my parents just as the lead creature seized my mother by the throat. Its grip was gentle, almost careful, but I could see the light beginning to fade from her eyes as it began the feeding process. "Stop!" I screamed, throwing myself between them. "Take me instead. I'm what you really want." The creature paused, my mother suspended in its grasp like a rag doll. "You still do not understand. We want all of you. The fear has returned, enhanced by desperation and love. You are all perfectly ripe for harvest." That's when I realized my last mistake. By trying to save my parents, by allowing terror and desperation to flood back into my emotional state, I'd restored exactly the conditions the creatures needed to feed effectively. My brief moment of acceptance and calm had been the only thing protecting us, and I'd thrown it away. But as the creature's free hand reached for me, I heard something that changed everything. The distant sound of approaching vehicles. Multiple engines moving fast across the frozen ground. Henrik Volkov had kept his word. Somehow the old man had realized what was happening and brought help. Through the darkness, I could see headlights bouncing across the rough terrain as trucks and snowmobiles converged on our property. The creatures heard them too, their heads turning in unison toward the approaching lights. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something like uncertainty in their glowing eyes. "It seems your community is more observant than we believed," the lead creature said. "No matter. We can feed quickly and withdraw before they arrive." But as the vehicles drew closer, I could see that Henrik hadn't just brought a few concerned neighbors. There were dozens of lights, suggesting a coordinated response that had been planned in advance. The old man had known this day would come, and he'd prepared for it. The first snowmobile crested the hill overlooking our property, and I could see Henrik himself driving it, with what looked like some kind of improvised flamethrower mounted on the front. Behind him came others, people I recognized from town, all armed with unusual weapons that suggested they had experience dealing with these creatures. "The deep dwellers!" Henrik shouted as he drove into the yard. "I told you to keep your family safe." The flamethrower roared to life, sending a stream of fire across the snow toward the nearest creature. The thing screamed and retreated, its rotting flesh evidently vulnerable to intense heat. The other creatures released their intended victims and began backing toward the tree line, their confidence evaporating in the face of organized resistance. "They fear fire," Henrik called out as more vehicles arrived. "Always have. Burns away the cold that keeps them animated." The lead creature shot me one last look of what might have been respect or regret before melting into the shadows with its companions. Within minutes, they had vanished completely, leaving behind only tracks in the snow and the lingering scent of decay. My family and I were safe, but the knowledge of what existed in the darkness beyond our property would never leave us. We moved away before spring, relocating to a city where the lights never completely went out and the spaces between buildings were too small for ancient horrors to hide. But sometimes, on the coldest nights, I still wake to the sound of breathing against glass. And I know that somewhere in the deep places, patient and hungry, they are still waiting, watching, learning, and planning their return. Two summers ago, when I was 15, my parents shipped me off to Pine Ridge Summer Camp in northern Vermont. They thought it would be good for me to get some fresh air and make friends, as my mother put it while packing my duffel bag with enough bug spray to fumigate a small town. I wasn't thrilled about leaving my Xbox and air conditioning behind, but the brochure showed kids swimming in a crystal-clear lake and roasting marshmallows around campfires, so I figured it couldn't be that bad. The bus ride took 6 hours through winding mountain roads that made my stomach churn with each hairpin turn. When we finally arrived, the camp looked exactly like the photos. Rustic wooden cabins scattered among towering pine trees, a pristine lake reflecting the afternoon sun, and a main lodge that could have been lifted from a Norman Rockwell painting. The air smelled of pine sap and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the rhythmic thunk of an axe splitting logs. I was assigned to Cabin 7, a weathered structure that housed 8 boys ranging from 13 to 16. The cabin's interior was sparse but functional. 4 bunk beds lined the walls, with a single light bulb hanging from the center beam. The floorboards creaked ominously under our feet, and the windows were covered with fine mesh screens that did little to keep out the persistent mosquitoes. Each bed had a small wooden cubby underneath for personal belongings, and the walls were decorated with decades-old carvings from previous campers. Names, dates, and crude drawings that spoke to the timeless boredom of summer camp life. Our head counselor was a college sophomore named Brett, a lanky guy with sun-bleached hair who seemed genuinely excited about camp activities. He gathered us around for introductions that first evening, and I quickly sized up my cabin mates. There was Kevin, a quiet 13-year-old with thick glasses who kept a journal. Tyler, a stocky 14-year-old who boasted about his wrestling achievements. Danny, a 16-year-old who clearly didn't want to be there. And several others whose names I've since forgotten. But then there was our assistant counselor who introduced himself as Preston. He appeared to be in his early 20s, with an athletic build and an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He claimed to be from Texas, spoke with a slight drawl, and had an unsettling habit of staring just a little too long when he thought no one was looking. While Brett launched into an enthusiastic explanation of camp rules and activities, Preston stood in the shadows near the door, his gaze slowly scanning each of us like a predator evaluating potential prey. Something about Preston made my skin crawl from the very beginning, though I couldn't articulate why. Maybe it was the way he lingered too close when helping campers with their luggage, or how his voice dropped to an almost whisper when speaking one-on-one with the younger boys. He had a habit of placing his hand on shoulders that lasted just a beat too long, and his compliments always carried an uncomfortable undertone that made me want to step away. That first night, as we settled into our bunks, Preston volunteered to help anyone who needed assistance organizing their belongings. I watched from my top bunk as he approached Kevin's bed, kneeling down beside the younger boy's luggage with what seemed like excessive interest in helping fold clothes. The way Preston's fingers lingered on Kevin's belongings, the soft murmur of his voice as he offered advice about camp life, and the uncomfortable shift in Kevin's posture all combined to create a scene that felt wrong in ways I couldn't define. I had chosen the bunk farthest from Preston's corner of the cabin, claiming I needed to be near the window for fresh air. In reality, some primitive instinct had warned me to maintain maximum distance from our assistant counselor. As I lay in my sleeping bag that first night, listening to the symphony of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl, I found myself grateful for that decision. Through the darkness, I could hear Preston moving around the cabin long after lights out, his footsteps pausing at various bunks for reasons that seemed unnecessary. The next morning brought the usual camp routine, a wake-up bell at 7, followed by calisthenics on the dewy grass outside our cabin. Preston led our exercises with military precision, barking out commands while circling our group like a drill sergeant. But his attention kept drifting to the younger boys, and I noticed how he positioned himself to get the best view of campers as they struggled through jumping jacks and push-ups. When one of the 13-year-olds complained about the difficulty of the workout, Preston was quick to offer personal training sessions after dinner. The first week at Pine Ridge passed in a blur of typical camp activities. We learned to tie knots, build fires, and paddle canoes around the lake. The food was terrible but edible, and most of the counselors seemed genuinely committed to making sure we had a good time. Brett organized evening activities like capture the flag and storytelling sessions, and during the day we rotated through various stations, arts and crafts, swimming lessons, hiking, and wilderness survival skills. But Preston's behavior grew increasingly disturbing as the days passed. He had a way of inserting himself into situations where he had no business being present. During swimming lessons, while other counselors supervised from the dock, Preston would wade into the shallow water, claiming he needed to provide hands-on instruction for the non-swimmers. I watched him guide younger boys through basic strokes, his hands remaining on their bodies far longer than necessary, adjusting their form with touches that seemed more intimate than instructional. At the Arts and Crafts Station, Preston volunteered to help with any project that required close proximity to campers. When Kevin struggled with a leatherworking project, Preston pulled up a chair directly behind him, reaching around to guide the boys' hands as they worked the tools. The positioning forced Kevin to lean back against Preston's chest, and I could see the discomfort written across the younger boy's face as he tried to squirm away without being overtly rude. The most disturbing incidents occurred during our cabin's evening downtime. After lights out, when Brett had gone to the counselor's lounge for their nightly meeting, Preston would remain in the cabin under the guise of maintaining order. But instead of ensuring we were settling down for sleep, he would move from bunk to bunk, engaging in whispered conversations that lasted far too long. He claimed he was checking to make sure everyone was comfortable and not homesick, but his attention focused almost exclusively on the youngest campers. I began keeping track of Preston's movements in a small notebook I kept hidden in my sleeping bag. From my strategic position near the window, I could observe most of the cabin without being obvious about it. Preston would typically start his rounds about 30 minutes after lights out, beginning with the bunks closest to his bed and working his way around the room. He spent an average of 5 to 10 minutes at each of the younger boys' beds, but barely acknowledged the older campers. One night, I watched him sit on the edge of Tyler's bunk for nearly 20 minutes, his voice barely audible as he spoke to the 14-year-old wrestler. Tyler appeared to be pretending to sleep, but I could see the tension in his body, the way his breathing remained shallow and forced rather than the deep, rhythmic pattern of actual slumber. Preston's hand rested on what appeared to be Tyler's shoulder or back beneath the blanket, moving in small, rhythmic motions that made my stomach clench with revulsion. The next morning, Tyler was unusually quiet during breakfast, picking at his scrambled eggs without his usual appetite. When I tried to engage him in conversation about the upcoming canoe race, he gave short, distracted answers and kept glancing toward the counselor's table where Preston sat laughing with the other staff members. The contrast between Preston's jovial public persona and his nighttime behavior was becoming increasingly apparent, and I began to understand that I was witnessing something deeply wrong. Kevin's behavior also started to change around this time. The quiet boy who had initially seemed excited about keeping a camp journal now appeared withdrawn and anxious. During activities, he would position himself as far from Preston as possible, and I noticed him flinching whenever our assistant counselor approached. When Preston offered to help Kevin with his swimming technique, the boy quickly declined, claiming he preferred to practice on his own. But Preston was persistent and skilled at creating situations where refusal seemed difficult or rude. He volunteered for lunch duty, positioning himself at the serving line where he could interact with every camper. He offered extra helpings to his preferred targets, engaging them in conversation that delayed the line and forced more interaction. When Kevin tried to grab his tray and move on quickly, Preston would ask detailed questions about his meal preferences or camp activities, keeping the boy trapped in conversation while his hand remained on Kevin's shoulder or arm. The other counselors seemed oblivious to Preston's inappropriate behavior, or perhaps they were deliberately overlooking warning signs they didn't want to acknowledge. Brett was focused on organizing activities and maintaining the camp's enthusiastic atmosphere. The other cabin counselors were college-age kids more interested in their summer jobs than protecting the campers under their care. Preston had positioned himself as the helpful, dedicated staff member who went above and beyond, making it difficult for anyone to question his motives without seeming paranoid or troublesome. Everything changed during the second week of camp on a humid Tuesday that started like any other. We had spent the morning at the lake learning advanced swimming techniques, followed by lunch and an afternoon hike to a nearby waterfall. The temperature was pushing 90 degrees, and the humidity made every activity feel like we were moving through thick soup. By evening, everyone was exhausted and looking forward to the relative coolness that came after sunset. After dinner, Brett announced that he needed to attend an emergency staff meeting regarding some administrative issues with the camp's insurance. This was highly unusual, as the evening hours were typically reserved for cabin activities and ensuring the campers settled down properly for the night. But Brett assured us he would return within an hour, leaving Preston in charge of Cabin 7, with strict instructions to maintain the normal bedtime routine. The moment Brett's footsteps faded into the distance, Preston's demeanor shifted noticeably. Gone was the jovial assistant counselor who cracked jokes and led enthusiastic cheers during meals. In his place stood someone with predatory focus, his eyes scanning our group with an intensity that made several of the younger boys shift uncomfortably in their seats. He announced that since it was such a hot night, he was instituting special cooling procedures that would help everyone sleep more comfortably. Preston began by adjusting the cabin's windows, opening them wider than usual, and positioning the single electric fan to create better airflow. This required moving several bunks slightly to optimize the air circulation, he claimed, and he personally oversaw each adjustment. But his movements were calculated and deliberate, creating opportunities for unnecessary physical contact as he helped boys move their bedding and personal items. His hands lingered on backs and shoulders as he guided their movements, and his voice dropped to that uncomfortable whisper I had noticed during previous evenings. When it came time for the younger boys to change into their sleeping clothes, Preston positioned himself strategically in the cabin, claiming he needed to ensure the windows remained properly secured for safety. This gave him an unobstructed view of the changing area, and I watched his eyes track the movements of Kevin and Tyler with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He offered commentary about the heat and the importance of wearing minimal clothing to stay cool, suggestions that felt inappropriate and unnecessary. As the evening progressed, Preston became increasingly bold in his behavior. When Kevin struggled to reach something in his upper cubby, Preston was quick to assist, pressing against the boy's back as he retrieved the item. The contact lasted far longer than necessary, and I could see Kevin's face flush with embarrassment and discomfort. Tyler, the usually confident wrestler, seemed to shrink into himself whenever Preston approached, his earlier bravado replaced by nervous energy and averted eyes. The breaking point came around 10 o'clock, well past our usual lights-out time. Preston had been moving around the cabin for over an hour, ostensibly checking on various campers and ensuring their comfort in the oppressive heat, but his attention kept returning to a small group of the youngest boys, and his conversations with them had taken on an increasingly personal and inappropriate tone. He asked detailed questions about their bodies, their experiences with puberty, and their relationships with friends back home, all under the guise of being a concerned counselor who wanted to help them navigate the challenges of adolescence. When Preston approached Kevin's bunk for the third time that evening, something inside me snapped. The 13-year-old was clearly distressed, his earlier journal-writing enthusiasm replaced by fearful glances toward the door and obvious attempts to avoid conversation. Preston sat on the edge of Kevin's mattress, his hand resting on what appeared to be the boy's leg beneath the thin camp blanket, and began speaking in that low, intimate voice that had become his signature during these evening sessions. From my position across the cabin, I couldn't hear the specific words, but Kevin's body language spoke volumes. The boy had pressed himself against the wall as far as possible while still remaining in his bed, his eyes wide and frightened in the dim light from the overhead bulb. Preston leaned closer, his voice becoming more insistent, and his hand moved in small motions beneath the blanket that made Kevin's breathing become rapid and shallow. I knew I had to do something, but confronting Preston directly seemed both dangerous and likely to make the situation worse for Kevin. Instead, I began making noise, rustling my sleeping bag, coughing loudly, and shifting around in my bunk as if I was having trouble sleeping. This forced Preston to pause his conversation and glance in my direction, breaking the intimate bubble he had created around Kevin's bed. "Everything okay over there?" Preston called out, his voice carrying a note of irritation at the interruption. "Just can't get comfortable in this heat," I replied, making my voice sound drowsy and innocent. "Maybe if we turned off the main light it would be cooler." This suggestion created an opportunity for Kevin to escape the immediate situation by volunteering to reach the light switch, which was located near the door and far from Preston's position. The movement broke the spell, and Preston was forced to abandon his focused attention on the younger boy, as the cabin plunged into relative darkness, illuminated only by moonlight filtering through the windows. But even in the darkened cabin, Preston's activities continued. I heard him moving around for another hour, the floorboards creaking as he visited various bunks. Whispered conversations continued, though they were harder to track without visual confirmation. Several times I heard muffled sounds that could have been sobbing, though they were so quiet I couldn't be certain of their source or meaning. The next morning brought no relief from the oppressive heat, but something else had changed in our cabin's atmosphere. Kevin barely spoke during breakfast, picking at his pancakes while staring blankly at his plate. Tyler was equally withdrawn, the confident wrestler replaced by a nervous boy who jumped at sudden sounds and avoided eye contact with anyone. The other younger campers seemed subdued as well, lacking their usual morning energy and enthusiasm for the day's planned activities. Preston, meanwhile, appeared refreshed and energetic, greeting everyone with his characteristic smile and enthusiastic commentary about the upcoming day. He had returned to his public persona of the dedicated counselor, organizing our breakfast line efficiently and engaging in cheerful banter with the other staff members. But I noticed how his eyes continued to track the movements of specific campers, and how he positioned himself to maintain visual contact with his preferred targets throughout the meal. Brett had returned from his emergency meeting, but he seemed distracted and overwhelmed with whatever administrative issues had required his attention. He announced that the camp's insurance company was requiring additional safety inspections of all facilities, which would necessitate several evening meetings with state officials over the coming week. This meant more opportunities for Preston to be left in charge of our cabin during the crucial evening hours when his inappropriate behavior typically escalated. The swimming activities that morning provided Preston with another opportunity to exercise inappropriate supervision. While Brett worked with the advanced swimmers on diving techniques, Preston volunteered to assist the beginners in the shallow end of the lake. This gave him license to provide hands-on instruction that involved extensive physical contact with the younger boys. I watched from the dock as he guided them through basic strokes, his hands remaining on their bodies far longer than necessary, adjusting their form with touches that seemed more intimate than educational. Kevin had become particularly reluctant to participate in swimming lessons, claiming he felt sick and asking to sit out the activity. But Preston was insistent that the fresh lake water would help him feel better, personally escorting the reluctant boy into the water despite his obvious discomfort. Once in the shallow area, Preston positioned himself directly behind Kevin, reaching around to demonstrate proper arm movements in a way that forced the younger boy's back against his chest. The scene was disturbing enough that several other campers began to notice and comment. Danny, the oldest boy in our cabin, made a joke about Preston being overly helpful, but there was an edge to his voice that suggested he was also uncomfortable with what he was witnessing. Tyler, despite his own apparent issues with Preston, attempted to intervene by suggesting that Kevin might learn better by watching from the dock first. But Preston dismissed the suggestion with a laugh and continued his inappropriate instruction. As the day progressed, Preston's behavior became increasingly bold and concerning. During the afternoon craft session, he volunteered to help with any projects that required one-on-one guidance. When Kevin struggled with a wood-carving assignment, Preston pulled his chair directly behind the boy, reaching around to guide his hands as they worked with the sharp tools. The positioning was unnecessarily intimate, forcing Kevin to lean back against Preston's body while their hands remained intertwined around the carving knife. Other counselors were present during these activities, but they seemed either oblivious to the inappropriate nature of Preston's assistance or unwilling to intervene. The arts and crafts instructor, a college student named Jenny, was focused on helping multiple campers simultaneously and appeared to view Preston's hands-on approach as helpful rather than concerning. When Kevin attempted to move his chair away from Preston, claiming he needed more workspace, Preston simply moved his own chair to maintain the close contact. The most disturbing incident of that day occurred during our afternoon rest period. The oppressive heat had prompted Brett to institute a mandatory quiet time in the cabins, during which campers were supposed to read, write in journals, or simply rest before the evening activities. Brett retired to the counselor's lounge to review the next day's schedule, again leaving Preston as the sole supervisor of our cabin. Instead of encouraging quiet activities, Preston announced that the heat made it necessary for him to conduct individual wellness checks to ensure no one was suffering from heat exhaustion. This involved him moving from bunk to bunk, claiming he needed to assess each camper's physical condition by checking for signs of overheating. For the older boys, these checks were perfunctory. A quick question about how they were feeling, followed by a brief touch to the forehead to check for fever. But for the younger campers, Preston's wellness checks became extended examinations that involved far more physical contact than any medical assessment could justify. When he reached Kevin's bunk, Preston sat on the edge of the mattress and began a detailed evaluation that included checking the boy's pulse at multiple points, examining his skin for signs of heat rash, and monitoring his breathing patterns in ways that required placing his hands on Kevin's chest and back. The examination lasted nearly 15 minutes and involved Preston removing Kevin's shirt to better assess his condition. Throughout the process, Preston maintained a running commentary about the importance of recognizing heat-related illness and the proper techniques for cooling down an overheated body. But his hands moved over Kevin's skin with a thoroughness that went far beyond any legitimate medical concern, and his voice carried that same intimate whisper that had become his signature during inappropriate interactions. Kevin endured the examination in obvious distress, his eyes wide and frightened as Preston's hands explored his body under the guise of medical necessity. Several times the boy attempted to move away or cover himself, but Preston was persistent, explaining that a proper assessment required thorough examination, and that Kevin shouldn't be embarrassed about receiving medical attention from a trained counselor. From my position across the cabin, I could see that this was no medical examination, but rather a calculated assault disguised as legitimate camp supervision. Preston's movements were deliberate and unnecessary, his touches lingering in areas that had no connection to assessing heat exhaustion. The other boys in the cabin had grown silent, instinctively recognizing that something wrong was happening, but lacking the knowledge or authority to intervene. When Preston finally concluded his examination of Kevin, the boy quickly replaced his shirt and retreated to the far corner of his bunk, curling into a protective position that spoke to his emotional distress. Preston made similar approaches to Tyler and two other younger boys, though their examinations were mercifully shorter and less invasive. But each interaction followed the same pattern: unnecessary physical contact, inappropriate intimacy, and medical justifications that couldn't disguise the predatory nature of his behavior. That evening marked the third consecutive night that Brett would be absent for emergency meetings. The pattern had become clear. Preston was systematically arranging to have unsupervised access to our cabin during the crucial hours when his inappropriate behavior typically occurred. Whether he was manipulating the administrative crisis or simply taking advantage of it, the result was the same: extended periods of time alone with vulnerable campers and no oversight from other staff members. As dinner concluded and we returned to our cabin for the evening, Preston's excitement was barely contained. He spoke more rapidly than usual, his movements sharp and purposeful as he organized the evening routine. He announced that the continued heat wave necessitated another round of special accommodations to ensure everyone could sleep comfortably. This involved rearranging bunks again, adjusting windows and fans, and creating what he claimed was optimal airflow throughout the cabin. But the rearrangements seemed designed to isolate the younger boys in a corner of the cabin where Preston could focus his attention without interference from the older campers. Kevin's bunk was moved closest to Preston's counselor station, followed by Tyler and two 13-year-olds whose names I've deliberately forgotten. The positioning created a natural barrier between Preston's target area and the rest of us, allowing him to conduct his evening activities with greater privacy. As the evening progressed, Preston's behavior became more aggressive and desperate. The pretense of medical examinations and wellness checks gave way to increasingly inappropriate physical contact that he justified through various camp-related explanations. He claimed that the younger boys needed instruction in proper sleep positions to prevent heat-related discomfort, demonstrations that required him to physically manipulate their bodies while they lay in their bunks. Kevin had become almost catatonic, responding to Preston's attention with glassy-eyed compliance that spoke to psychological trauma rather than willing participation. The boy who had arrived at camp excited about keeping a journal and learning new skills had been reduced to a frightened shadow of his former self. His journal lay abandoned in his cubby, its pages blank since the night of Preston's first intensive examination. Tyler's response was different but equally disturbing. The confident wrestler had become hypervigilant, his eyes constantly tracking Preston's movements around the cabin. But his athletic background seemed to make him a particular target for Preston's attention, with our assistant counselor frequently commenting on Tyler's physical development and muscle tone in ways that were clearly inappropriate. Preston had begun timing his evening rounds to coincide with Tyler's preparation for sleep, offering unsolicited advice about athletic performance and body development that created opportunities for unwanted physical contact. The breaking point came when Preston announced that he needed to conduct a special orientation session for the younger campers to help them better adapt to the camp environment. This session would take place in the counselor's corner of the cabin, away from the main sleeping area, and would involve individual consultations with each of the boys under 16. The older campers were instructed to remain in their bunks and engage in quiet activities while the orientation was conducted. I watched in horror as Preston called Kevin over first, directing him to sit on the counselor's bunk while they discussed adaptation strategies for dealing with homesickness and camp anxiety. But the conversation quickly devolved into inappropriate personal questions about Kevin's body, his experiences with physical development, and his relationships with family members. Preston's hands remained in constant contact with the boy throughout the conversation, ostensibly offering comfort and reassurance, but actually engaging in systematic grooming behavior. When Tyler was called for his orientation session, I could see the teenager's internal struggle between his natural athletic confidence and his growing fear of Preston's attention. Tyler attempted to maintain a casual, unafraid demeanor, but his voice cracked as he answered Preston's increasingly personal questions. Preston positioned himself directly beside Tyler on the narrow counselor bunk, their bodies pressed together in a way that left no doubt about the inappropriate nature of the interaction. The orientation sessions with the other younger boys followed similar patterns, each lasting between 20 and 30 minutes and involving extensive physical contact that Preston justified through various counseling techniques. He claimed he was teaching them breathing exercises for anxiety, muscle relaxation techniques for better sleep, and confidence-building exercises that required trust and physical cooperation. But every technique involved inappropriate touching and positioned Preston in ways that gave him access to the boys' bodies under the guise of legitimate camp counseling. During one of these sessions, I heard muffled crying that Preston quickly covered with loud instructions about proper breathing techniques. The sound was heartbreaking and enraging, confirming that these boys were experiencing trauma but had no way to escape or seek help. Preston had positioned himself as a trusted authority figure, and the isolated camp environment made it nearly impossible for the victims to reach outside support or even understand that what was happening to them was wrong. By midnight, Preston had concluded his orientation sessions and announced that the younger boys needed additional cooling measures due to the extreme heat. This involved him moving from bunk to bunk, ostensibly adjusting their bedding and sleepwear to prevent overheating. But his actions were clearly designed to provide opportunities for continued inappropriate contact under the cover of darkness and the pretense of medical necessity. I lay in my bunk feeling helpless and complicit, knowing that terrible things were happening just a few feet away, but lacking any clear avenue for intervention. Preston had created a system where resistance seemed impossible and where speaking out would likely result in retaliation against the victims rather than protection for them. The isolation of the camp environment, the authority structure that positioned counselors as unquestionable figures, and Preston's skill at manipulating situations to his advantage had created a perfect storm for predatory behavior. As I listened to the quiet sounds of distress from the younger boys' bunks, I knew that someone needed to take action before Preston's behavior escalated further. The pattern was clear. Each night brought more aggressive and inappropriate contact, and the psychological damage to his victims was becoming increasingly apparent. But I also understood that any action I took would need to be carefully planned and executed to ensure the safety of the boys who were being victimized. The next morning brought a profound change in the atmosphere of our cabin. What had once been a group of excited teenagers enjoying their summer camp experience had transformed into a collection of traumatized boys struggling to maintain normal appearances while dealing with ongoing psychological assault. Kevin had stopped speaking entirely, communicating only through nods and headshakes when directly questioned. Tyler had developed a nervous tic, constantly checking over his shoulder and jumping at unexpected sounds. Preston, meanwhile, had grown even bolder in his behavior, apparently interpreting the boy's compliance and silence as acceptance of his authority and actions. He began implementing new cabin policies that created additional opportunities for inappropriate contact and isolation. Morning wake-up procedures now included individual physical assessments to ensure everyone had slept well and wasn't suffering from heat-related fatigue. These assessments involved Preston checking each younger boy's pulse, temperature, and general physical condition in ways that were clearly unnecessary and inappropriate. Brett remained overwhelmed with administrative duties, now meeting with state officials every evening to address the insurance crisis that seemed to grow more complex each day. His absence had become routine, and Preston had effectively assumed complete control over our cabin's evening and nighttime hours. The other counselors were dealing with their own administrative burdens and seemed relieved that Preston was willing to handle the additional supervisory responsibilities. I had spent the previous night planning potential courses of action, each of which carried significant risks and uncertain outcomes. Confronting Preston directly could result in retaliation against his victims and might simply force him to become more secretive rather than stopping his behavior. Reporting his actions to Brett or other camp officials required evidence that would be difficult to obtain and might not be believed given Preston's reputation as a dedicated counselor. And any attempt to contact outside authorities would be nearly impossible given the camp's remote location and limited communication access. But the situation had become desperate enough that inaction was no longer an option. Kevin's psychological state was deteriorating rapidly, and I feared that the trauma he was experiencing might have permanent consequences if it continued much longer. Tyler was showing signs of severe anxiety and depression that interfered with his ability to participate in normal camp activities. The other younger boys were exhibiting various stress responses that ranged from withdrawal to aggressive outbursts that seemed completely out of character. My decision came during that morning's swimming lesson when I witnessed Preston's most blatant assault yet. While Brett worked with advanced swimmers on the far side of the lake, Preston had taken the beginners to a secluded cove that was hidden from view by overhanging branches. Under the pretense of teaching proper swimming techniques, Preston had begun systematically removing the boys' swim trunks, claiming that unrestricted movement was essential for learning correct form. The scene was horrifying and unmistakable in its intent. Preston had isolated 4 of the youngest boys in an area where his actions couldn't be observed by other staff or campers. He was methodically undressing them while maintaining his characteristic whisper of instruction and encouragement. The boys stood in the shallow water, naked and clearly terrified, while Preston positioned himself to have unrestricted access to their bodies under the guise of swimming instruction. Kevin was sobbing openly now, his earlier compliance replaced by obvious distress that Preston attempted to dismiss as normal anxiety about learning new skills. Tyler had assumed a protective position near the other boys, his wrestling instincts engaged despite his own fear and trauma. The scene represented a complete abandonment of any pretense of legitimate camp activities, and I knew that intervention was required regardless of the personal risks involved. I began swimming toward the secluded cove, creating noise and commotion that would alert Preston to my approach and force him to abandon his current activities. As I drew closer, I called out questions about swimming techniques and requested assistance with my own stroke development, creating a legitimate reason for my presence that would be difficult for Preston to dismiss. The interruption forced him to direct the boys to redress themselves and return to the main swimming area, breaking up the assault before it could progress further. But my intervention had clearly angered Preston, and I could see the calculation in his eyes as he assessed the threat I represented to his activities. For the remainder of the day, he watched me with undisguised hostility, looking for opportunities to retaliate or neutralize my interference. During lunch, he made several comments about campers who didn't respect authority and the consequences that awaited those who caused trouble for camp staff. His message was clear. Any further interference would result in serious consequences for both me and his primary victims. That afternoon, I made the decision to attempt contact with outside authorities despite the significant obstacles involved. The camp's main office had a telephone that was theoretically available for emergency use, though access was strictly controlled and monitored. During the afternoon rest period, while Preston was conducting his usual inappropriate examinations of the younger boys, I slipped out of the cabin and made my way toward the administrative building. The main lodge was largely deserted during the afternoon hours, with most staff members supervising activities or attending meetings. I located the office telephone and attempted to place a call to my parents, hoping to convince them to contact local authorities about the situation at camp. But the call quality was poor due to the remote location, and explaining the complex situation over a scratchy connection proved nearly impossible. My parents initially dismissed my concerns as typical homesickness and camp adjustment problems, unable to comprehend the severity of what I was describing. My second attempt involved calling the local sheriff's department directly, but this proved even more problematic. The dispatcher was skeptical of a teenage caller reporting counselor misconduct at a summer camp, particularly when I couldn't provide specific details about the nature of the inappropriate behavior without betraying the privacy of the victims. The remote location of the camp and the lack of immediate physical evidence made it difficult to convey the urgency of the situation or convince authorities to take immediate action. As I concluded my unsuccessful attempts at outside contact, I discovered that Preston had noticed my absence from the cabin and was actively searching for me. I could hear his voice calling my name throughout the camp, ostensibly looking for a missing camper but actually trying to locate a potential threat to his activities. I managed to return to the cabin through a back route that avoided the main pathways, but Preston's suspicious glances throughout the evening made it clear that he suspected my involvement in some form of resistance. That night, Preston's behavior reached new levels of aggression and desperation. With Brett absent for another emergency meeting, Preston announced that the continuing heat wave required immediate implementation of the most extreme cooling measures yet. This involved what he termed intensive body temperature regulation that required the younger boys to submit to extended physical examinations that he conducted in complete privacy behind a makeshift curtain he erected in the counselor's corner of the cabin. The crisis reached its climax on Friday night of the second week, during what would become Preston's final hours of unsupervised access to our cabin. Brett had announced that the insurance meetings would continue through the weekend, meaning Preston would have extensive opportunities to escalate his predatory behavior without interference. The younger boys had reached a state of psychological breaking point, with Kevin now completely non-responsive to normal conversation, and Tyler displaying symptoms of severe trauma that interfered with his basic functioning. Preston seemed to sense that his time at camp was limited, either due to the eventual resolution of the administrative crisis or the increasing likelihood that his victims would find ways to report his behavior. His actions that evening carried a frantic quality, as if he was attempting to accomplish as much as possible before losing access to his targets. He abandoned much of his previous pretense about medical necessity and camp regulations, instead relying on direct intimidation and threats to maintain control over the situation. The evening began with Preston announcing that the extreme heat had created a medical emergency that required immediate and intensive intervention. He claimed that several boys were showing signs of severe heat exhaustion that could progress to life-threatening heat stroke if not treated immediately. This medical crisis, he explained, necessitated emergency procedures that would override normal camp policies and privacy considerations. The younger boys would need to submit to extensive physical cooling treatments that required complete cooperation and absolute secrecy to protect the camp from liability concerns. Preston's emergency cooling treatments were clearly designed to provide maximum opportunity for sexual assault under the guise of medical necessity. He had prepared what he claimed were special cooling compounds that needed to be applied to specific areas of the body to prevent heat stroke. The application process required the boys to remove all clothing and submit to hands-on treatment that involved Preston's thorough examination and manipulation of their bodies. Kevin was selected for the first emergency treatment, and I watched in horror as Preston isolated him behind the makeshift curtain he had erected for privacy. The sounds from behind the barrier were heartbreaking: muffled crying, Preston's insistent whispered instructions, and the obvious sounds of struggle as Kevin attempted to resist the assault. Preston's explanations about medical necessity became increasingly aggressive as Kevin's compliance wavered, with clear threats about the consequences of refusing emergency medical treatment. When Tyler was called for his emergency cooling treatment, the teenager finally reached his psychological breaking point. The confident wrestler who had arrived at camp just 2 weeks earlier was now a traumatized boy whose athletic training was his only remaining source of personal power. As Preston attempted to guide him behind the privacy curtain, Tyler suddenly erupted in violent resistance, shouting that he wouldn't submit to any more examinations and demanding that Preston leave him alone. The confrontation escalated rapidly as Preston attempted to use his authority and intimidation tactics to force Tyler's compliance. But Tyler's wrestling background had given him both physical strength and an understanding of leverage and control that Preston hadn't anticipated. When Preston attempted to physically force Tyler behind the curtain, the teenager responded with techniques learned on the wrestling mat, breaking free from Preston's grip and creating distance between them. Preston's reaction to Tyler's resistance was swift and violent. Abandoning any pretense of medical concern or camp authority, he launched himself at Tyler with obvious intent to overpower the boy through physical force. but Tyler was ready for the assault, using his wrestling skills to defend himself while shouting for help and alerting the other boys to the true nature of the situation. The physical confrontation lasted only a few minutes, but it shattered the atmosphere of intimidation and secrecy that Preston had carefully cultivated. As Tyler grappled with our assistant counselor, the other boys began to understand that resistance was possible and that Preston's authority was not absolute. Kevin emerged from behind the privacy curtain in various stages of undress, his tear-stained face telling the story of what had been happening during those private medical examinations. I joined the confrontation as soon as it began, using my size advantage to help Tyler restrain Preston while the younger boys moved to safety near the cabin door. Preston fought with desperate fury, apparently understanding that his exposure was complete and that his access to victims was ending. He threatened us with expulsion from camp, criminal charges for assaulting a counselor, and various other consequences that he claimed would result from our interference with his legitimate camp duties. But his threats were empty now, and everyone in the cabin understood the true nature of his behavior. The younger boys began speaking for the first time about what Preston had been doing to them during his private examinations and orientation sessions. Their accounts were heartbreaking and infuriating, describing systematic sexual assault that had been disguised as medical care and camp counseling. Kevin's story was particularly devastating, detailing repeated assaults that had occurred over nearly 2 weeks while the rest of us slept nearby. The noise from our confrontation eventually attracted attention from other cabins and staff members who were still awake. Brett returned early from his meeting upon hearing reports of a disturbance in our cabin, arriving to find Preston restrained on the floor while Tyler and I held him down and the younger boys huddled near the door in obvious distress. The scene was unmistakable in its implications, and Brett's initial confusion quickly gave way to horrified understanding as he assessed the situation. Preston made several attempts to control the narrative, claiming that he had been attacked by disturbed campers who had misinterpreted his legitimate counseling activities. He insisted that the boys were lying about inappropriate behavior, and that their accusations resulted from homesickness, heat-related delirium, and teenage rebellion against authority. But his explanations were contradicted by the physical evidence in the cabin, the obvious distress of his victims, and the testimony of multiple witnesses who had observed his predatory behavior. As additional staff members arrived and began investigating the situation, Preston's composure finally cracked completely. Faced with overwhelming evidence and multiple witnesses, he abandoned his claims of innocence and began making threats against anyone who reported his behavior. He claimed to have influential connections who would protect him from consequences and insisted that the boys' testimony would be dismissed as the fantasies of troubled teenagers. His threats were specific and detailed enough to reveal the calculated nature of his predatory behavior and his confidence that the camp environment would shield him from accountability. But Preston had underestimated both the severity of his crimes and the determination of his victims to seek justice. Tyler's physical resistance had broken the psychological hold that Preston maintained over the younger boys, and they began providing detailed accounts of his behavior that painted a clear picture of systematic sexual abuse. Kevin, despite his psychological trauma, was able to describe specific incidents that corroborated the observations Tyler and I had made during our weeks of witnessing Preston's inappropriate behavior. The immediate aftermath of Preston's exposure was chaotic and traumatic for everyone involved. Camp officials called local law enforcement and emergency medical services to respond to what had become a clear case of child sexual abuse. Preston was arrested that night and removed from the camp in handcuffs, his threats and denials continuing even as he was placed in the back of a sheriff's vehicle. The sight of our former assistant counselor being led away in restraints provided some sense of justice, but it couldn't undo the trauma he had inflicted on his victims. Kevin, Tyler, and the other boys who had been victimized by Preston were taken to a local hospital for medical examinations and psychological evaluation. The process was necessary but traumatic, forcing them to relive their experiences while providing evidence for the criminal case against their abuser. Kevin required extended counseling and medical care, his psychological trauma having manifested in physical symptoms that included sleep disorders, anxiety attacks, and regression in his developmental progress. Tyler's recovery was complicated by his role in finally stopping Preston's predatory behavior. While he took pride in his physical resistance and the protection he had provided to the other victims, he also struggled with guilt about not acting sooner and anger about the failure of camp officials to recognize and prevent the abuse. His wrestling coaches and family worked extensively with counselors to help him process the trauma while maintaining his athletic goals and personal confidence. My own role in the events created complex emotions that required professional support to address properly. While I was proud of my eventual intervention and assistance in exposing Preston's crimes, I also carried significant guilt about the weeks of abuse I had witnessed without taking more aggressive action. The knowledge that my delayed response had allowed additional trauma to occur weighed heavily on me, despite reassurances from counselors and law enforcement that the responsibility lay entirely with Preston. The investigation into Preston's background revealed a disturbing pattern of predatory behavior that extended far beyond his actions at Pine Ridge Summer Camp. Law enforcement discovered that he had used false credentials to obtain his position at the camp, claiming counseling experience and training that he did not possess. His real name was not Preston, and his claimed background from Texas was completely fabricated. He was actually a registered sex offender from another state who had violated his parole by traveling to Vermont and assuming a false identity to gain access to potential victims. The criminal case against Preston proceeded rapidly due to the overwhelming evidence and multiple victim testimonies. He ultimately pled guilty to numerous charges of child sexual abuse, assault, and identity fraud, in exchange for a lengthy prison sentence that would keep him away from potential victims for decades. The plea agreement spared his victims from having to testify in open court, though several chose to provide victim impact statements that detailed the ongoing effects of his abuse on their lives and development. Pine Ridge Summer Camp faced serious legal and financial consequences for their failure to properly screen Preston's background and protect the campers under their care. The camp's insurance coverage proved inadequate for the lawsuits filed by victims' families, and the facility ultimately closed permanently after the summer session concluded. Brett and other counselors were cleared of any criminal wrongdoing, but the camp's reputation was irreparably damaged by the scandal and the revelation that a child predator had been given unfettered access to vulnerable campers. The broader impact of Preston's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case prompted changes in state regulations governing youth camps and the background check requirements for counselors and staff members. New protocols were implemented to ensure better supervision of camp activities and clearer reporting procedures for suspected abuse. While these changes came too late to prevent Preston's crimes, they provided some hope that future generations of campers would be better protected. For Kevin, Tyler, and the other boys who survived Preston's abuse, the road to recovery was long and difficult. Each required extensive counseling and support to process the trauma and develop healthy coping mechanisms. Kevin's family moved to a different state to provide him with a fresh start and access to specialized treatment programs. Tyler continued his wrestling career but required ongoing therapy to address the anxiety and trust issues that resulted from his victimization. My own experience at Pine Ridge fundamentally changed my understanding of predatory behavior and the vulnerability of children in institutional settings. The knowledge that such abuse could occur under the guise of legitimate authority relationships made me more vigilant about protecting younger people and more willing to speak out when I observed concerning behavior. The guilt about my delayed intervention motivated me to become involved in organizations that work to prevent child abuse and support survivors. The memory of that summer remains vivid and disturbing more than 2 years later. The knowledge that children can be systematically victimized by trusted authority figures while other adults remain oblivious or unwilling to intervene is a sobering reminder of how predators exploit institutional power structures. Preston's crimes were enabled not just by his own calculated manipulation, but by a camp environment that prioritized convenience and cost-cutting over child protection. The courage shown by Tyler in finally resisting Preston's abuse, and by Kevin in providing testimony despite his trauma, demonstrated the resilience that children can display even in the most difficult circumstances. Their willingness to speak truth to power and seek justice for themselves and other victims was inspiring and humbling. The experience taught me that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply refuse to remain silent when we witness injustice, even when speaking out carries personal risks. Preston's conviction and imprisonment provided legal justice, but the psychological and emotional consequences of his crimes continue to affect his victims and their families. The experience serves as a permanent reminder that vigilance and courage are required to protect vulnerable people from those who would exploit positions of trust and authority. While the immediate crisis was resolved, the broader responsibility to prevent such abuse requires ongoing commitment from institutions, families, and individuals who refuse to allow predatory behavior to continue unchallenged. Today, as I reflect on those terrifying weeks at Pine Ridge Summer Camp, I am grateful for the strength shown by Preston's victims and the ultimate triumph of justice over predatory behavior. But I am also haunted by the knowledge of how easily such abuse can occur and how many children may be suffering in silence while trusted adults fail to recognize or respond to the warning signs. The responsibility to protect children is one that belongs to all of us, and Preston's crimes stand as a stark reminder of what happens when that responsibility is abandoned or ignored. Growing up in the small town of Iron River in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, I always loved the outdoors. As a kid, I spent my summers swimming in the cold, clear waters of Lake Michigan, fishing for brook trout in the gurgling streams, and camping under the stars in the dense forests of the Ottawa National Forest. My best friends Nick, Josh, and I were inseparable. Every weekend, we'd load up our backpacks with gear and disappear into the woods for days at a time, roughing it in the backcountry. We thought we were invincible. But things changed when I turned 18 and went off to college at the University of Oregon. I studied forestry and spent my free time exploring the rugged, misty forests of the Pacific Northwest. The woods there felt ancient and primordial. Huge, gnarled trees dripping with moss. The distant cry of a raven echoing through the fog. It was both beautiful and unsettling. When I graduated, saddled with student loan debt and unable to find a decent-paying job, I convinced Nick and Josh to join me on an epic cross-country camping trip. One last hurrah before we had to grow up and face the real world. We'd hit the most remote wilderness areas in the country, starting in Oregon, then heading to the forests of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and finally ending in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. What I couldn't know then was that we were about to come face to face with an ancient evil lurking in the shadows of the forest, something straight out of the darkest folklore, and that it would change us forever if we survived. We began our journey in mid-June, planning to spend a week trekking through each state's backcountry before moving on to the next destination. First up, the dense, rain-drenched temperate rainforests of Oregon's coastal range. Damn. It's like something out of Jurassic Park, Josh said in awe as we hiked deeper into the old-growth forest of Siuslaw National Forest. Massive Douglas firs and Sitka spruces towered over us, their branches arching together hundreds of feet above our heads to form a thick green canopy. Prehistoric-looking ferns and skunk cabbage sprouted from the spongy, decomposing undergrowth. As the light faded and evening set in, we made camp in a mossy clearing alongside a fast-moving stream. The temperature dropped quickly in the damp air. While Nick and Josh sat around the campfire drinking whiskey, I wandered off into the darkening woods to gather more firewood. Bending to pick up a fallen branch, I suddenly froze. Shattering the stillness came a long, moaning cry that sent chills racing down my spine. It sounded almost human, but not quite. The wail rose in pitch before tapering off with a strangled gurgle. Then silence. Heart pounding, I grabbed the wood and hurried back to the safety of the fire. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked uneasily. "Hear what?" Nick said. "An elk bugling, maybe. There's a herd around here." An elk. Right. That had to be it. As unsettling as the cry had been, I forced myself to shrug it off. We were in the middle of nowhere, after all. Of course we'd hear strange animal calls. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been something else. Something watching us from out there in the darkness, and that this was only the beginning. The next morning dawned cool and misty. Dew clung to our tents and soaked through our boots as we broke camp. I hadn't slept much, my mind replaying that eerie wail over and over. But in the light of day, it seemed far less menacing. Just a wild animal, I told myself firmly. We hiked deeper into the forest, following faint game trails that snaked between the massive, furrowed tree trunks. By late afternoon, we reached our goal, a remote alpine lake, its surface like polished glass reflecting the snow-capped peaks towering above. "Damn, we've got the whole place to ourselves," Josh crowed excitedly, dumping his pack on the pebbly shore. "Who wants to go for a swim?" "I'm in," Nick said, already yanking off his shirt. Normally, I'd have been the first one diving in, but a strange foreboding prickled the back of my neck as I gazed out across the mirrored surface of the water. "I think I'm gonna take a pass," I said. "Didn't sleep great last night. Gonna rest up." "Suit yourself," Nick shrugged, wading in. The water barely rippled around his thighs. While they swam, I got a fire going and unpacked our food. The sun inched toward the jagged peaks, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and pink. "Guys, chow time," I eventually called. No response. I walked over to the shore, scanning the lake. Nothing but flat, glassy water stretching out before me. The hairs on my arms stood up. "Nick? Josh? Quit messing around." My voice sounded high and thin in the waiting stillness. Silence. Then, somewhere out in the middle of the lake, a disturbance in the water. Ripples radiating out. And suddenly, Josh's head breaking the surface, mouth stretched wide in a scream. "Help! Nick! Oh God, it's got Nick!" I charged into the shallows, the icy water stealing my breath. Josh flailed and splashed, eyes rolling wildly. Then, in a surge of water, he vanished. The surface smoothed, tranquil once more. Alone on the shore, I stood frozen with horror and disbelief. Something had taken them. Something in the dark water, pulling them down, down, down. How I made it back to civilization on my own, I'll never know. Those next hours were a panicked blur of crashing through the forest, their final screams ringing in my ears, my mind unable to process the enormity of what I'd just witnessed. I must have looked like a madman when I finally stumbled into a ranger station, raving about some unseen force snatching my friends from the remote mountain lake. I saw the looks the rangers exchanged as they listened to my disjointed story. Looks that said, "This guy's lost it." But they had to investigate. Of course, by the time the search and rescue team reached the lake the next day, there was no sign of Nick or Josh. No tracks or traces, no clues to what had taken them, like they had vanished without a trace. Trauma, the police said. Delayed drowning, maybe. A terrible accident, to be sure. But these things happened. 2 young men swimming in an ice-cold alpine lake after a few drinks. Their muscles probably seized up. Tragic, but not uncommon. I knew none of their explanations could account for the sheer horror I'd seen in Josh's eyes in those final moments, or the feeling of a malevolent presence in those woods, watching us, hunting us. But I had no proof, and so I buried it deep, tried to move on, even as their loss left a void that could never be filled. After the funerals, unable to face the pitying stares and whispers, I fled back to my hometown in Michigan. But even there, the ghosts of that terrible day haunted my every step. I saw their faces in every shadow, heard their dying screams on the wind. I knew it was only a matter of time before the darkness found me again, before I had to face the nightmare that lurked in the forest once more. Months passed. The leaves turned, winter swept in with a vengeance. but even blizzards burying my hometown in deep snow couldn't blot out the memories. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something, or I'd go mad. And so I found myself back on the road, chasing the dead ends of obscure folklore and myths, trying to make some kind of sense out of what had happened, to find proof that I wasn't crazy, that Nick and Josh had been victims of something ancient and evil. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, poring over moldering old books in small-town libraries, cornering locals in dive bars to pry out whispered legends of dark things stalking the forest. Everywhere, scraps and fragments of old stories, strange disappearances, trappers vanishing without a trace, inhuman shrieks echoing from the woods. But nothing concrete. Until an eccentric old hunter in the remote wilds of northern Wisconsin reluctantly shared a tale passed down in his family for generations. A story of a malevolent spirit said to haunt the forest. The wendigo. It was once human, he told me, voice low and gravelly. But the hunger, the greed, the evil, it twisted them, turned them into something that ain't human no more. A soulless, ravenous thing, always hungering, pale as bone, teeth like needles, razor claws. It lures the unwary into the deep woods, mimics human voices, calls from the shadows. And then he trailed off, watery eyes haunted. They say it can't be killed. Fire's the only thing it fears, but God help you if it catches your scent. The wendigo. I'd heard vague tales, always dismissed as myth. But now, for the first time, I had a name to put to the primordial dread that had stalked us in Oregon. I knew it was only a matter of time before I faced it again. I had to be ready. Blowing the last of my meager savings, I outfitted myself as best I could for what was to come. Layers of thermal gear, fire starters, hatchets, hunting knives, climbing gear. If the wendigo wanted me, I wouldn't go down without a fight. And so I found myself deep in the ancient, mist-shrouded forests of the Blue Ridge Mountains in early spring. One last stop on my quest for answers before the thing in the shadows finally caught up with me. I'd rented a remote cabin, miles from any other living soul, surrounded by dense stands of hickory, pine, and fir. As far from help as I could get. The first few days passed uneventfully as I explored the area, scouting game trails and dense thickets. But on the fourth night, I woke suddenly, heart hammering against my ribs. The fire had burned low, casting eerie shadows on the rough-hewn log walls. From outside, somewhere out in the darkness of the forest, a long wail rose, undulating and inhuman, ending in a rattling, gurgling moan that sent icy tendrils of fear skittering down my spine. I knew that sound, echoing from my darkest memories. It had found me again. Hands shaking, I threw logs on the fire, built it into a roaring blaze. The flames beat back the darkness, pressing against the small cabin's windows. But the wendigo was out there. I could feel its hunger, its simmering rage. I sat up till dawn, shotgun across my knees, jumping at every creak of trees in the wind. But it didn't attack. It was toying with me, drawing out the game. Sooner or later I'd have to face it. And this time, only one of us would walk away. The next day dawned deceptively calm and bright. But even the cheerful birdsong and the breeze sighing through the leafy canopy couldn't dispel the sense of malevolent watchfulness, of a predator's gaze tracking my every move. I knew I couldn't simply hunker down and wait for the wendigo to make its move. Sooner or later, I'd have to take the fight to it, draw it out of hiding, before the waiting drove me mad. By late afternoon, I'd fashioned a sturdy makeshift spear, its tip honed to a razor point, slick with pine sap to make it burn. With a final deep breath to steel my nerves, I stepped off the cabin's porch and into the waiting forest, following the game trails ever deeper into the shadows, heading toward where I somehow knew it would be. Seconds stretched into minutes. The sinking sun slanted through the trees, painting the forest floor in blood-red streaks. Birdsong faded. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. I felt the weight of its gaze, a pressure between my shoulder blades. A twig snapped behind me, too loud in the stillness. I spun, spear raised. Shadows shifted between the trees. Glimpses of desiccated, grayish skin pulled taut over jutting ribs. Limbs too long and gaunt to be human. The glint of jagged teeth, of hooked claws. With an unearthly howl, it launched itself at me, faster than anything had a right to move. I threw myself to the side, lashing out with the spear, felt it connect. A high, enraged shriek split the air. Then the wendigo was on me. We crashed to the ground in a flurry of teeth and blood and needled claws. Half-glimpsed horrors, a ravening hunger barely contained in the twisted remnants of a human form. The stench of rotting meat and ancient earth. Claws raked my face, my arms, shredding flesh. But I couldn't feel the pain. A cold, clear focus descended. With a roar of fury and terror, I drove the spear up under its ribs with all my strength. It shrieked, clawing at the shaft, oily black blood spurting. The wound smoked and sizzled. "For Nick and Josh, you bastard!" I snarled through blood-flecked teeth. Wrenching the spear free, I stabbed it down again and again, till my arms ached and its body stopped its grisly twitching. I staggered back, chest heaving. It lay still, twisted and broken. But even as I watched, flesh knit back together, bones crackled and popped back into place. Dead eyes, pale as a winter sky, snapped open, horribly aware. Oh God, it couldn't be killed. Lurching to my feet, I limped back toward the cabin as fast as my battered body would take me. The crackle of undergrowth behind me, the pant of eager breath, told me it was already hunting once more. I barely made it back to the cabin before my legs gave out. Blood ran into my eyes, soaked my shredded clothes. Somehow I dragged myself inside, barred the door. The creature slammed against it a moment later, howling in fury, a force of pure, distilled malevolence and insatiable hunger. But the thick log walls held. For now. With shaking hands, I built up the fire, feeding it broken bits of furniture till it roared and crackled. The old hunter had said it feared only flame. All I could do was pray he'd been right. The thing shrieked and gibbered outside, circling the cabin, seeking a way in as the night deepened. I clutched my spear, knuckles white, struggling not to give in to the insanity of terror threatening to devour me. At some dark hour of the night, an awful silence fell. For a long time, I heard nothing. Then drifting from the distance, the high, desperately welcome wail of sirens. Blue and red lights strobed between the trees as vehicles pulled up outside. Shouts pounding at the door. "Hello? Anyone here? This is the Forest Service." They broke down the door, took in the scene of carnage. My ravaged face, the blood soaking the floor. I must have looked like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. I tried to explain what I'd seen as the EMTs treated my wounds, begged them to keep the fire burning, to be on guard. That it was still out there. That it would never stop coming. I saw the all too familiar looks on their faces, the slow head shakes. "Trauma," they said. "Blood loss and shock. You're safe now." I didn't have the strength to argue. I let them lead me away, pour me into an ambulance. But as we bumped down the rough forest road, I peered out the back windows, back at the dark tree line. For just a moment, I glimpsed a pale figure darting between the trunks, fleshless and gaunt, little more than skin stretched over jutting ribs and long bones, needle teeth bared in a hellish grin. It raised one emaciated arm, waved, as if in mocking salute. Then it vanished back into the darkness of the forest, waiting, always waiting. Sooner or later I knew it would find me again, no matter how far I ran. And then the last chapter of this story would finally be written. In blood and madness and the dying light of the fire,